Elizabeth, when we consider, and welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio, the implications that the birthright citizenship, or really nationwide injunction ruling, ultimately have today, are we being alarmist about those implications, or do you have serious concern?
So I have serious concerns, and I think you need look no further than the dissents that were filed in this case. You know, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson signed hers with deep disillusionment. I dissent. And I think that idea that, we look to the Supreme Court to be the ultimate enforcer of the rule of law. And here, I think with this ruling, there is a lot of turning its back on lawlessness. As Greg rightly said, this was not about the merits of the birthright citizenship order. And indeed, at the oral arguments, when this case was being heard just on this injunction issue, there did seem to be deep skepticism, even from the conservative justices, on the constitutionality of the birthright citizenship order. It's completely contrary to constitutional text and over a century and a half of settled precedent. But even so, they're essentially saying this unconstitutional violation of a fundamental individual right can go forward unless individuals get their own lawyers, file the fee to get into court, file their own lawsuits, and can get that individual relief instead of a broader injunction. There are, of course, ways in which people can band together, for example, through class actions, and some of that has already happened today. But there are also procedural hurdles, including some that have been made higher by this Supreme Court, for class actions as well. So the concern is that a lot of lawless behavior by the executive will go unchecked and people's rights will be violated because of this ruling.
Well, Elizabeth, we had a very similar conversation earlier today. We were on the early edition of Balance of Power with Robert McWhirter, civil rights attorney, talked about the court's decision, specifically how it would impact class action lawsuits. Listen to his take.
It takes away a lot of the power of the courts to help people affect their constitutional rights. It allows any president to do something blatantly unconstitutional and not have the court be able to enjoin all similar people. You can maybe get an injunction for your individual case, but there are thousands of people that presidential policies affect. This is not good for individual people who want to assert their rights when a president does something unconstitutional.
I wonder if it's good for the Supreme Court as well, Elizabeth. Does this mean that they'll be hearing thousands of cases from individuals instead? How is that better?
I certainly don't see how this is good for the rule of law or anyone who stands to be supporting and enforcing the rule of law, which the Supreme Court's highest duty is to do so. He's absolutely right. And I think, a way for viewers and listeners to think about this, the birthright citizenship guarantee we might not think applies to us, although it does. If the guarantee of equal citizenship birth is taken away for children of undocumented immigrants, it's certainly unclear how it would go forward for everyone in the future. But think about other very clear rights in the Constitution: Second Amendment gun rights, right to free exercise of religion. If an executive, the president, came in and said, and I'm not saying this president would do this, but in a hypothetical, Catholics can no longer go to Mass. That is obviously unconstitutional, obviously a violation of our individual rights. And so would we have to go, each of us, or to pass the high procedural hurdles for a class action, to go in instead of having, a group of representatives get a nationwide injunction first, stopping such a deep violation of a sacred constitutional right? That's what we're looking at here because of this decision.
Well, Elizabeth, when we don't take this decision in isolation, but also view it against the backdrop of other rulings we've gotten from this particular court, including the decision around presidential immunity for official acts, what have they in aggregate done to the power of the executive branch of government?
Yes, I think that they have strengthened potential lawlessness from the executive branch and taken away their own ability to be a bulwark of liberty and democracy and freedom that the Constitution sees them to be in the separation of powers that is laid out in the Constitution. Certainly the idea that the court must be there to stop unconstitutional, lawless behavior is a principle I think everyone can agree on across the ideological spectrum. And so this ruling today, I think, is, it's not just one that should be decried by opponents of President Trump's policies, but everyone who believes in the rule of law and that the court should stand for the rule of law and stop constitutional violations, even when, or perhaps especially when, they come from the President of the United States and the executive branch.